Major new development in understanding of Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. It's been over 2 years since the painting of Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci was decoded and elaborated down to important details. But the work that was done turned out to be incomplete. This presentation is about an important major addition to the understanding of the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. To bring up to speed, the next 2 slides will provide a quick recap of the existing findings. This video and the research it is based on are not the product of artificial intelligence or any other automated research and writing tools. The material is new, and not all statements in this video have the same potential to withstand the test of additional research, time and reason. Use at your own discretion. And you know what? All rights reserved. The narrative is heavily dependent on the supplied visual material. Please, do not hesitate to pause the video to get a better look. From past experience, it is known that some viewers are irritated by the narrated voice. Please, keep in mind that you can mute the sound and simply read from the slides. The slides will continue to change after narration is finished in the background. I do not have a quality of voice and performing ability to do my own voiceovers. The budgetary considerations are also a factor in the choice of robotic voiceover versus a live one. Questions and comments are welcome. Famous painting, Last Supper, by Leonardo da Vinci is a final report of the secret 15th century research project about Christianity and a secret message to humanity about the project. 11 men and 2 women depicted to tell all what really happened 2,000 years ago. The message about the epic dirty battle of 2 religions that resulted in the death of a vulnerable adult who did not know any better. Following is a list of characters left to right, with their long-perceived names and the names in Leonardo's report. John the Baptist, sectarian leader and mastermind, former disciple Bartholomew. Initiated abuse of Jesus as a vulnerable adult. Wife of Pontius Pilate and Pontius Pilate himself, corrupt by the influence of the sect of John the Baptist. He has his just washed hands outstretched to dry, former disciples James the Minor and Andrew. Peter and Judas, swordsmen of Jesus' protective detail with their commanding officer Mary Magdalene, formerly known as disciple John. Judas was also an accountant of Jesus, as Jesus has dyscalculia, inability to do the math. Jesus, talented actor and neurological patient with his brother James the Just, formerly a disciple James the Major. Leonardo tried to capture the moment when James is trying to pry out of Jesus what is it he did at the temple and why. Jesus had a neurological tantrum due to multiple personality disorder and dyscalculia, and, as often the case, had no memory of the event, and cannot provide a meaningful explanation. The head of the formerly disciple Thomas, in the back stands for a Gospel of John with its high Christology. Mark, Matthew and Luke are standing for synoptic Gospels, with the age of each man corresponding with time that has passed since the crucifixion. Formerly known as disciples Philip, Matthew and Jude/Thaddeus. Figure of traditional Judaism in the priestly robe, formerly known as the disciple Simon Zealot, antagonist of the sect of John the Baptist in the Gospels story. This was a short recap of what was discovered about 2 years ago. It was noted in the original decoding that figures with the rectangular shapes, or books, over their backs, synoptic Gospels Mark, Matthew and Luke are arranged in the setting resembling 3-headed dog Cerberus from the Greek myth about Hades. It reflects sarcastic feelings of Leonardo about the Gospels. The age of each man roughly corresponds to the time since the crucifixion of Jesus until the writing of the Gospel that he represents. The head of the man visible behind the figure of James the Just, opportunistic brother of Jesus and high-ranking sectarian associate of John the Baptist, was assumed to be standing for the Gospel of John that is very different from synoptic Gospels. The finger pointing to heaven was assumed to be a tribute to high Christology of Jesus in that Gospel. The official name of the figure was disciple Thomas. That was considered a good fit for the decoding, as Thomas plays a certain role in the Gospel of John where he probes wounds of Jesus with his finger to make sure that he is seeing resurrected Jesus and not some other person, Doubting Thomas story. All of the above considerations are still valid and reiterated to provide a background to the discovery that is a subject of this presentation. It should be noted that Markan priority, the correct order of Gospels, is 300 years older than academic scholarship presumed it to be. It is much older in reality, and Leonardo just reiterates it. It should also be noted that Leonardo stipulated early writing of the Gospels. His Mark is barely 20 years of age, and that corresponds to the year 50 CE, not year 70 CE, as modern academic scholarship continues to insist as the date of the writing of that Gospel. To help the understanding of this presentation, I feel the need to reiterate yet another concept that is not embraced by academia at this point of time. Christianity is not based on Judaism, at least not directly. Christianity based on the religion that was created within the short-lived sect of John the Baptist. In his painting, Virgin with Child and Two Angels, Andrea del Verrocchio, who was Leonardo's teacher, provides illustration for his methodology. The one-of-a-kind mountain formation on this painting is a diagram of religious development up to his day. In the bottom is traditional Judaism that begins to get split into the Holy Land, Temple, variation and Diaspora variation. On the top of it is a pancake, that is the sect of John the Baptist. Academic studies refer to the adherents of the sect as eschatological Jews. There is a world of difference, however, between the sect with the structure and simple variation in beliefs. Eschatological expectations did spill into the general population and were reflected in funeral rituals, but the sect was a separate entity. The base demographic of the sect were Jews in Roman service and employment, and included retired Roman military. Sect had connections with Roman administration on many levels over the years. Pontius Pilate was coerced into cooperation by the sect at some point, including the trial of Jesus, also he lost the bid to save him. The presence of Vulgate, we know it is a Vulgate because it is only based on the Catholic part of Christian formation, Orthodox Christianity, shown split from Catholic, use scripture in different languages, is a very encouraging sign for the researchers like me who are not proficient in ancient languages. What can be figured out in Latin can be done in English. So it happened, my latest curiosities focused on the Gospel of Thomas. Rediscovered among the throe of Nag Hammadi writings, the Gospel of Thomas is a subject of lively research that is not based on any 18th or 19th century traditions. At the same time, this research is symptomatic of what is wrong with biblical research by card-carrying academia. I do not know what it is, inflated respect, fear to offend or concern about the career, but in several presentations about this gospel the key points are consistently missed. It is not easy to get over the fact that people from the eyewitness circle treated Jesus' material frivolously and intentionally modified it to suit their minute, political purposes. Jesus' words got twisted, the needed conclusions made for him when he never made those himself, and he made to talk and care about things that he never did while he was alive. Members of the close circle like Peter, James the Just and Mary Magdalene knew all there is to know about Jesus, and also knew that there is a little of value among the things he said. The earliest gospel, Mark, engaged in twisting things with abandon, and one of the people that had a major role in the writing was James the Just, half-brother of Jesus. Being in the middle of everything, James knew the truth and willingly participated in creating a world-class distortion, a documentary with masked characters and special effects. Textual analysis allows us to conclude that the disciple James in the Gospel of Mark is the James the Just himself. It is painfully obvious that James the Just is also a person behind the writing of the Gospel of Thomas. The saying number 12 reveals his audacity and his giant ego. There are not many people who will write that about themselves. The disciples said to Jesus, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is to be our leader?" Jesus said to them, "Wherever you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being." Not bad for a sectarian functionary who made his way on top over the dead body of less fortunate founder John the Baptist. For the record, Jesus was never a contender. The context of the Gospel of Thomas serves several lowliest purposes. One of them to drive a wedge between Peter and Paul/Mary Magdalene. Another purpose is to create an illusion that some kind of valuable secret teachings of Jesus existed. In fact, they did not. Jesus' public teachings were banalities at best, and in private he was as bad as in public. He was a badly affected neurological patient. He was often in the tough spot and lost for words. He had no training or skill in rhetoric. In the meantime, while I was working on materials related to the Gospel of Thomas, the ancient mosaic from Ravenna caught my attention. Here the official description of the mosaic in question. Late 5th century mosaics, Cappella Arcivescovile, Ravenna, Italy. These exceptional mosaics are a unique window into the Italy of late antiquity a few years before the Byzantine reconquest. Medallion image of Christ with Christ depicted as being beardless with a cruciform golden halo. His clothing is purple with a golden stripe, representing both his human and divine natures. Christ is looking directly at the viewer from the top of the arch. Medallion images of St. James and St. Thomas. St. James is shown as a young man with a dark beard wearing white vestments, a sign of purity. He is identified by a Latin inscription Iacobs. St. Thomas is likewise identified as a young man with a slightly longer beard and is also wearing white vestments. He is identified with a Latin inscription as Thomas, decorative cruciform floral motifs and images of birds, which symbolize angelic beings. This chapel was built in the late 5th century by Archbishop Peter II of Ravenna, 494–519, circa 495, and was dedicated to Saint Peter Chrysologus, Archbishop of Ravenna, 433–450. The chapel is part of the Museo Arcivescovile di Ravenna, which was founded in 1734 and is the oldest diocesan museum in Italy. The Archbishop's Chapel is considered to be a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. This mosaic is an astonishing archaeological artifact with far-reaching consequences. Let's start with the obvious. All three faces are very similar. As for bearded two faces, it could be said that it is a face of the same man, only younger and older. This is a very fascinating mosaic combo, and for an unusual reason at that. I stated in my book that in most places in the Gospel of Mark the person who is listed as the disciple James is really James the Just, brother of Jesus. That is why the face of James and the face of Jesus look so similar. Jacobus is the same as James. The person who designed the mosaic apparently was aware of the fact. James, a close associate of John the Baptist, became the head of the Jerusalem section of the sect and influenced the writing of the Gospel of Mark. He hid his participation in Jesus' ministry. But that is only a half of the meaning of this mosaic. Few years later, the Jerusalem section of the sect engaged in the squabble with the Gentile section headed by Mary Magdalene and her son Paul. As a measure of asserting authority, James the Just, now a bit older, authorized writing another gospel that now is not in canon and called the Gospel of Thomas. Real disciple Thomas left the movement right after the death of Jesus, appalled by an outrageous suggestion that Jesus came back to life. Truthful part of this story is in the Gospel of John 20 verses 24 and 25. The fabricated fabulosity immediately follows in John 20 verses 26 to 29. Over 20 years later, James, humorously naming Thomas, literally the twin, as useless twin brother of Judas Iscariot who left the sect by the way of suicide, wrote the sarcastic and menacing text aimed at Paul and Mary Magdalene. He even brought up the rumor of her being a prostitute before she met Paul's father, a young Roman centurion of equestrian origin. The saying 105, "He who shall know father and mother shall be called the son of a harlot," is the thinly veiled threat to slander their reputation. Paul aligned with Peter and pushed back, having James stoned to death when Romans had the change of governor in Jerusalem. In the meantime, this mosaic is depicting James the Just as Thomas, a pseudonym he used in that gospel with dire consequences. Pietro Perugino, Delivery of the Keys. A fresco painted in 1481 to 1482 in Sistine Chapel, Vatican. The influence of Mary Magdalene and Paul eventually caused a change of guard in Jerusalem, part of the sect. From Josephus Flavius and Acts we know that James was mobbed and killed and Simon, brother of Jesus, replaced him. Simon, brother of Jesus, happens to be the codename of Peter originated in Mark 6 verse 3 and Matthew 13 verse 55. The events related to the takeover were probably the reason for legal troubles for Peter for the rest of his life. To remove doubt, Perugino depicted Paul's sister beside him, looking much like Mary Magdalene, their mom. Paul's sister mentioned in Acts 23 verse 16. Peter, a man with military background and seasoned veteran of security services, was serving his old master, Mary Magdalene, yet again. Woman that once ordered Peter to kill Jesus or break him free from custody, single-handedly, was in charge of the sect. We now know that story as a triple denial, Mark 14 verses 66 to 72. Here is a group of painters on the right that were aware of this historical understanding in the late 15th century. Easy to recognize: Bellini, his brother-in-law Andrea Mantegna, Verrocchio, Leonardo's teacher, and some others. That was not rocket science. They figured. Rubens, 135 years later. Christ hands over keys to St. Peter, 1615, painted for the tomb of Bruegel the Elder. Obviously the same Mary, Peter, and Paul as in Perugino's keys. James the Just getting pushed, elbowed to the back, both in life, history, and the leadership in Jerusalem. Curiously, Jesus is shown with crucifixion wounds, post-resurrection. This is a tweak from the Gospel of Matthew 16 verse 18. This is a verse when Jesus, still pretty much alive, allegedly entrusted Peter with the leadership of the church. That is an allusion to the obvious much later interpolation by Peter in the Gospel of Matthew, same way as James did in the Gospel of Thomas sometime before. On the side note, Gospel of Matthew most likely was written still under the guidance of James before his death. Long dead Judas, a giant swordsman and a true friend of Jesus, looks with disbelief as his former associates continue to abuse memory of Jesus years after his death by crucifixion. As a curious detail, both Peter and Judas have peculiar hook-shaped noses in the painting of Rubens. That shape of noses has nothing to do with Jewish origin of Peter and Judas. But those noses reminded me of paintings where I've seen them before. None other than Leonardo da Vinci depicted Peter, Judas, and Mary Magdalene, operatives of sectarian security services, with hook-shaped noses as distinction of their affiliation. And right opposite to them are James the Just, flanked by apostles Thomas and Philip that, as was stated before, stand for Gospels of John and Mark. Taking another look at the whole setup, I slowly came to the conclusion that there is yet another layer to what is depicted by Leonardo da Vinci. The internal sectarian conflict started looking increasingly plausible as a context of that second layer. There is one obvious logistical problem, however. The Gospel of John has nothing to do with James the Just and sectarian conflict, as it was written decades later. It slowly dawned on me that two personages on the Last Supper by Leonardo work two full-time jobs at once. Just like the Gospel of John, Judas Iscariot has nothing to do with sectarian conflict. He died by suicide decades before the conflict took place, as he could not get over the meaningless, torturous death of his friend Jesus. Everybody else, by the way, did get over it. It is not difficult to figure out who the figure that has long been presumed as Judas represents in the framework of sectarian conflict. It is Mary's boy apostle Paul. The difficulties of Leonardo in depicting Judas are well known. Judas was a giant swordsman of Jesus' protective detail assigned by John the Baptist himself, along with Peter. Paul, on another hand, while carrying his service sword everywhere, was not noted for his fighting prowess, and was, probably, intimidated by his mom and women in general. The solution about replacing the Gospel of John that is out of context related to James the Just and sectarian conflict is much less intuitive. In hindsight, the solution that disciple Thomas represents the Gospel of Thomas, looks simple only on the surface. For starters, this solution assumes that Leonardo da Vinci was familiar with the Gospel of Thomas. In Latin, Leonardo was not known to read Greek, and religious books were mostly available in those two languages in the days of Leonardo. That alone would be a hard sell of an idea, as nobody ever heard or seen such a thing. Information about the Gospel of Thomas was available from the patristic writings, but details were few and far between. To incorporate the Gospel of Thomas in his painting, I would presume that Leonardo needed to know better than a few bits and pieces. Composition-wise, Gospel of Thomas fits perfectly. Thomas depicted showing the middle finger, digitus imputicus, to Paul, Peter and Mary Magdalene on behalf of James the Just. From the available translation of Nag Hammadi unearthed Coptic specimen, we know that this interpretation of Thomas was perfectly rational. Gospel of Mark and Gospel of Thomas are written with major input from James, and placing those two by his side has a good merit. It is also worth noting that to annoy Mary Magdalene, a security officer with the largest body count in history, in such a manner was not a good idea. James the Just was steamrolled out of the way and Pauline Christianity won the day. As for purposes of making sure that Leonardo really meant to depict the Gospel of Thomas, there is no better way to do it but to go for support to Caravaggio. Caravaggio, artist who lived, painted and died for the Resistance. Intellectual resistance continues a century after Leonardo. 2. Supper at Emmaus reiterate the Last Supper. Notably, Gospel personages are not included in both suppers at Emmaus. All personages, except Jesus, are aged, and we clearly see how Caravaggio visualized James. Caravaggio tried to emphasize the main theme of Leonardo's Last Supper. In both Supper at Emmaus, Jesus' associates are shown asking the very same question, "Jesus, what is it you did at the temple and why?" As mentioned, both Supper at Emmaus are dedicated to the same main theme as Last Supper by Leonardo, namely Jesus being questioned by associates about what is it he did at the temple and why. Jesus, as he did on many occasions, hit back with grievances about the bread they ate and wine they drank being due to his tireless efforts, his flesh/body and his blood. He really was not able to answer, as that was a neurological tantrum caused by dyscalculia and multiple personality disorder. Patients in his conditions are unable to recall the tantrum. He probably was not able to exchange money to perform a sacrifice at the temple. Apparently, aged personage of James the Just from the Supper at Emmaus was reused in the painting, The Incredulity of St. Thomas. The shell on his chest is an allusion to the hidden role of James in Gospel of Mark, as disciple James is a shell, and that interpretation was introduced by Albrecht Dürer in 1516. Just because the painting involves Thomas, also in a very traditional way, probing the wound of Jesus, as described in Gospel of John, the painting obviously deserves a closer look. It is most obvious that in The Incredulity of St. Thomas, Caravaggio reused much aged personages of Leonardo that stand for Gospels. Thomas, now obviously standing for himself, also the narrative is in the Gospel of John, and Philip, standing for the Gospel of Mark, both much aged. The figure of James is behind them, as if James is behind those Gospels, as co-author and instigator. It has the same meaning as in Leonardo's, where James is flanked by Thomas and Mark, who are both his brainchildren and his sinister creative output. For those who are not convinced by Caravaggio, there is yet another rendering of The Incredulity of St. Thomas, this time from 1823 and by Belgian painter François-Joseph Neves, 1787 to 1869. This is a large, significant work. It is now in the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, museum purchase funded by the Agnes Cullen Arnold Endowment Fund. It is very easy to recognize the characters in this painting. Three men standing together are Matthew, Mark and Luke, arranged by age, also mischievously made to look like Peter, Judas and Mary Magdalene. They are the same way as in the Last Supper by Leonardo, and many other paintings. Also Mark, the youngest one, is in the middle. Two men on the right side are standing for the two authors of the Gospel of John. Dual authorship of Gospel of John was well known in the framework of the intellectual resistance from the early 16th century onward, at least. The Gospel of John was often depicted as two men. The only other personage besides Jesus is Thomas, probing the wound. There is no doubt that in this painting Thomas is standing for the Gospel of Thomas, just like the rest. To affirm that Jesus is shown holding his hand up with all 5 fingers outstretched, affirming that there are 5, not 4 Gospels as the basis of the conclusions by Leonardo and others, and by me in my book. As for using fingers for counting, Jesus most likely did it when he was alive, just ask Albrecht Dürer.